So this is what's on my mix bus in Logic Pro. One of the biggest reasons mixes end up sounding cluttered and over-processed is because people try to perfect every single track. Every part has its own EQ, every track has a compressor on it, the vocals are stacked with these crazy long vocal chains, and before you know it, you've got 100 plugins running, and the mix sounds totally cluttered and lacking in separation. Now, I've mixed thousands of tracks over the years, and my best mixes are the ones where I'm doing very little processing on the individual tracks and spending less time on the mix itself. Because if I can make 3 decisions that improve the entire mix, instead of making 50 tiny decisions across 50 different tracks, then that's almost always going to be the best route to take. And that's exactly what the mix bus is for. I use the mix bus to shape the feeling of the entire song, and I do this in 3 very simple but powerful ways. So today I'm going to show you what those 3 ways are and how you can apply this thinking to your mixes so you can do less processing of individual tracks and instead spend time shaping the overall tone of the mix in a way which complements the feeling of the song. So this is the 6th episode in the series where I'm mixing this track from start to finish, focusing just on the feeling and the emotion in a mix, rather than getting bogged down in super specific plugins or techniques or any of that kind of stuff. If you haven't caught up on the whole series yet, you can do so right now on the playlist link below. This week, as I say, we're talking about mix bus processing. And if you're not familiar with that term or you're not really sure what it means, you feel a bit unclear on what it is. Basically, in short, I have this bus here in my mix template called the mix bus, and everything in the mix is routed to this mix bus. You can see everything here is routed to bus 1, some stuff goes to bus 2 with 3, which is the drum bus, and then ultimately the drum bus is then sent to bus 1. So everything in the mix is coming to this one singular bus over here. And on this mix bus, we're going to focus on the 3 things that shape the mix using broad strokes. And this is, I think, the most effective way to get the mix to the finish line without doing a ton of over-processing and getting caught up in overcooking the details. So just to demonstrate how effective mix bus processing can be if you're somebody who doesn't really do any mix bus processing, I have these presets here from my Ultimate Mastering Pack, which is basically just a pack of starting points that I created for the mix bus or for mastering that allow me to get to a kind of polished end result a bit quicker. So if you're working on the production of a track, for example, and you just want it to feel a bit more polished, you want it to feel a little bit more finished, then you can use these starting points to sort of get you to that result a bit quicker. So if I just put up something like this Gentle Touch preset from the pack, which is designed to just be a bit of a gentle mix bus processing, you can see if I A/B this on and off, let's start with it off and then I'll turn it on, you can see how much of a difference it can make to shape the overall tone and the feeling of the mix.
When I think about my life, I think about yours. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh.
So you can hear just from bringing up that preset that the mix suddenly has more clarity, it feels wider, it feels more alive, and it feels more ethereal and uplifting, I think, just from using a preset. So if we dial this in properly and we actually build a mix bus chain specifically for the feeling of this track, then it can be really, really effective. What I would say first is mix bus processing is one of those things which sounds technical straight away. And I think so many people get bogged down in the technical stuff that they actually completely forget why they're even doing this part of the process in the first place. Because all of this technical stuff is for one thing and one thing only, which is to enhance the emotional center and the feeling of the song. So I will explain all of the technical stuff as we go, the what and the how, but ultimately we're focused on why we're doing any of this in the first place. So let me break that down now. So we're going to clear the mix bus of any plugins and processing for the time being. Let's just go to remove all effect plugins. And now we're going to get into the 3 things that I mentioned that I do when I'm shaping this mix bus. So the first reason that I'm doing any mix bus processing is to control the dynamic of the overall mix. Now, when people talk about mix bus compression and dynamic control, they often use the term glue and mix bus glue, but they never really explain what that means or how to hear it or even what it does. But they just give no explanation for it. So I kind of hate that term. Basically, what I'm using the mix bus compression for in my mixes is firstly to control any rogue peaks that jump out. So you might have like a backing vocal part where the vocal jumps out a little bit, or there might be like a lead guitar part, or in this case, there's these lead parts in the bridge and in the instrumental that come in where they jump in dynamic a bit and they can poke out a little bit. And we could go into all of those individual parts and we could compress those individual parts. But often that's how you end up with stuff that sounds a bit choked and a bit overcooked. But instead, by inserting a compressor on the mix bus and just doing some gentle compression to the whole mix, you can control those rogue peaks and just settle them down a little bit. Think of it like patting a dog on the head. You know, we're not trying to slam compression down onto the whole mix. We're just trying to gently pat the mix on the head and soften anything that feels like it's trying to jump out of the mix. And also what happens when we do that mix bus compression and we bring the overall level of the mix down a touch, when we raise the level back up, we're also bringing the floor of the mix up with it as well. And what that does in real terms is it brings some of the detail out in the background of the mix. So stuff that's super quiet, stuff that's sitting in the back of the mix, like reverb tails and delays and little sort of sparkly moments, it just brings them forward a little bit more, which gives a bit more focus to the mix and makes the details of the mix come out a little bit more. And in doing that, in bringing those peaks down and softening those peaks and bringing forward all the stuff that's in the back of the mix, we achieve cohesion and what people, I guess, refer to as glue. The reason that we're getting that sort of gluey sound is because we're just bringing all of those parts together a little bit more and just bringing it together in a way which feels more cohesive. So let's try some mix bus compression on this mix and see if we can control any of these things that are maybe jumping out and just give the mix a bit more tightness and cohesion. So we're going to add the compressor to this mix bus. I like to sometimes also just add the gain plugin ahead of this in case we need to do any trim. I spoke at the beginning of this series about how I use the VCAs for gain staging the mix, but sometimes when you get to this stage you just need to like pull down a little bit of input gain, sometimes a dB or two. So it's useful to have a gain plugin at the start of the chain. So I have the compressor plugin. I'm going to go to the Vintage VCA, which is an SSL style compressor. One thing I'm also going to do here is I'm going to switch this from stereo to dual mono mode. And that allows us just to have independent control of the left and the right side of the compressor if we need to. So it means that, you know, maybe if you need to change the threshold on the left-hand side to compress the left-hand side of the mix a little bit more, we can do that. It just gives us a bit more control. I'm going to keep it coupled so whatever we do on the left-hand side is affecting the right, but it's useful just to have it in dual mono mode sometimes to get a little bit more control. I like a super fast release because it means the compressor is always reacting so that you don't end up with pumping that you get sometimes from having a really long release time, which makes the mix feel a bit squashed and a bit mushy. I think having a super fast release for me gives me the energy and the feeling that I want in the mix. And then I'm going to set the attack time to around about here, somewhere 120 milliseconds or so, and that's just going to allow those initial transients through in the mix. So we're not hitting the mix bus too hard with super fast compression. It's a slower thing, but it's also releasing quickly, and the combination of the slow attack and the fast release is what's going to give us a bit more control. 2-to-1 ratio, because as I said, I just want to pat it on the head. I don't want to slam the mix. And then let's find where the threshold feels good.
When I think about my life, I think about yours. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, when I think about my life, I think about yours. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it.
Yeah, straight away that feels nice. It feels like there's more cohesion to the mix. It feels like there's a little bit more energy and that the details are a bit more in focus. And particularly when it gets to that bridge part, the details in the tails of the sound and stuff feel a little bit more present. Everything feels like it's locked together a little bit more. And it just feels like there's a bit more energy. Let's just go to that bridge part again. One thing I want to try is to just allow the low end through in the mix. I'm going to set this to high pass filter. We're going to set this to, let's set it to about 100 Hertz. And that's just going to allow the low end to not be affected by the compressor. And sometimes we can get a little bit more cohesion in those sparkly bits by doing this. So for me, when I turn that filter off and we allow the low end to be affected by the compressor, I feel like we lose some of the impact of that downbeat. Whereas with the filter on, it gives more clarity to the kick drum and that downbeat of the low end. And that's something that I've talked about throughout the series as being really important to this mix and being fundamental to the feeling and the groove of the song. So this is where we make these kind of decisions based around feeling. So that's really all it needs, I think, in terms of mix bus compression. This song is not a particularly dynamic song. It's pretty straightforward, you know, it just kind of grows and grows quite slowly and it gets to this big sort of instrumental bridge part and then it just sort of fades out. So there's not these huge changes in impact and there's not this big explosive chorus. It's just something that grows and grows and there's all these little details that come in and out. And those details are the things we want to just make sure that nothing is jumping in terms of dynamic. So that's what we're using the mix bus compression for in this mix. I'm not using it to bring any more energy or impact to sections. I'm just using it to just bring everything together a little bit more and soften things out. Okay, so we've talked about the first reason why I do mix bus processing, and that is to control the dynamic of the mix. The second reason that I use mix bus processing is to control the width of the mix. And often this presents itself in the form of enhancing the width of the mix and making it feel bigger and wider and as if it's taking up more space on the soundstage between the speakers. Now, the center of this song specifically is the groove. We've talked about this throughout the whole series. The groove is fundamental to the feeling and the message of the song. It's about driving in the summer, and that feeling comes from the kick and the snare and the bass part and everything that sits, that rhythm section that sort of sits in the middle of the mix, literally in the center of the mix. And on top of that is the vocal, and those things are kind of the centerpiece of this song. So why enhance the width of the mix if what's really crucial to the feeling of the song is the stuff that lives in the center of the mix? Well, for me, if you stripped out everything else and you just left those grooving, driving parts and the vocal that occupy the middle of the mix, you took away everything else, what you'd be left with was probably something that sounded a bit like a boring, flat band practice by an indie band who are missing a few members. Because what makes this song feel dreamy and ethereal and floaty are all the parts that move around the groove and occupy the wide areas of the mix. So there's all these delicate details that float around and they move around from the left to the right, and that's what gives the softness and the kind of dreamy, ethereal feeling to this mix, as well as this driving groove. So the two things play off of each other, and that's what allows the song to evolve and ultimately get to this part in the bridge where it feels like it's floating and you're sort of driving off into the sunset. It's because of all these little details that come in from the left and the right. So by enhancing the width in those wide areas, we're bringing more detail to the mix, but we're also making it feel dreamier and making it feel more airy and just feel nicer, I think. So in order to enhance the width of this mix, what I'm going to do is insert an instance of the linear phase EQ on the mix bus, which is basically the channel EQ, but it's in linear phase mode, which essentially means that we can process the whole mix without introducing any strange phase shifts and stuff that can happen when you're EQing the whole mix. You can use the standard channel EQ if you want. You can use any EQ. In this case, I'm going to use the linear phase EQ for this particular process. And what I'm going to do is go down to this processing part here where it says stereo, and I'm going to set this to side only. And what this is going to do is it's only going to affect the sides of the mix, whatever we do on this EQ. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to right click on one of these nodes and I'm going to set it to linear 12 dB, which basically just means we can push it. We get a little bit more like precision because we can go up to like 6 dB here, whereas if we were in linear 30 dB, there's not as much precision. And similarly, if we go to 60. So we're going to keep it at linear 12 dB, and we're going to push this top end shelf probably around about 7.5, maybe a bit higher, maybe a bit lower, see what feels good. And what that's going to do is it's only going to boost the high frequencies in the left and the right. It's not going to boost the high frequencies in the middle, and that's going to give the illusion that the mix is wider and more open and more airy and more dreamy, and hopefully enhance the feeling of the mix.
Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it.
Yeah, I love that. I love what that's doing. It's really enhancing the width. It's enhancing those things like the mellotron part, which are moving around, and this bells part, which is kind of annoying that comes in. The VHS chimes, which are these like really detuned bells.
Say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it.
By boosting that width, it means we can actually drop the level of the VHS chimes so they become this sort of weird, like ethereal feeling that something's moving around, rather than having to be this present thing that needs to be louder so we can hear it. We can drop it down, so you're just getting this weird, like detuned, swirling feeling happening in the back and the sort of width of the mix because we've done this boost. You'll notice I also actually shifted it back to linear 30 dB so that we could push it even more. I'm pushing it 10 dB at 3.5K, which is a lot. Like that's a big EQ curve. But it's because there's not a lot of detail in the top end of this mix really until you get those sparkly bits coming through. So it felt good to push it further. Let's push it further. I don't worry really too much about what the numbers say. It's quite an extreme boost by what I would normally do, but I think it feels good. It sounds good. And it's really helping to enhance the width and that ethereal, dreamy feeling of the song. So that brings me on to my third and final reason for using mix bus processing, and that is to shape the overall tone of the mix. And this is probably the thing that has the biggest impact on the feeling of the whole song. So I think of this as like having the tone control, the treble and the bass control on your hi-fi, if you're old enough to remember what hi-fi is, or like the EQ control in your stereo in your car or in streaming platforms, whatever it is you're using that have got sort of this master tone shaping control. This is kind of how I treat it in terms of using it on the mix bus. And this is really important, I think, because when people hear your music, they're hearing it as one cohesive song. They're not hearing it as 50, 60, 70 tracks or whatever. Like they don't hear all these individual parts in the way that you know that they're there. So by doing broad strokes overall tone shaping on the whole mix, you're treating it the way that the listener's going to hear it. You're hearing it the way the listener's going to hear it, and you're able to manipulate it like that. And ultimately, that often leads to you being able to do less individual processing on those parts and overcooking those parts because you've done that big broad strokes processing. But it's important before you start just jumping in and trying to like chuck an EQ on and boosting things and cutting things, is to make sure that you remember what the plan for your mix is in the first place. And I said when we started this, I want to respect the low mid of the mix because that's where a lot of the warmth is. I wanted to have this nostalgic feeling. I wanted to have this character to it, that it feels a bit old school. It feels maybe a bit tapey. If we're doing any tone shaping that's throwing out that balance in the low mid, then it's probably not going to be the right thing. We need to make sure that we have that in mind all the time. What I would say here as well is, as much as I hate the phrase less is more, I think the sentiment is true in this case, that a little often goes a long way when it comes to mix bus tone shaping. Okay, so keeping in mind what we've spoken about so far in the series and the mix wanting to have this sort of analog feeling, this feeling that was recorded on tape as if it's got this nostalgic feeling like a memory from the past. In order to create that, that's where we're going to start with our tone shaping. Now in Logic you have a few different options for this because the saturation stuff all sounds pretty good. You can use Chroma Glow with this magnetic setting, which I think is supposed to sort of emulate a tape machine kind of sound, but I just don't get on with this plugin. I can never get it to sound how I want it to sound. I feel like it often makes things sound squashed and a bit sort of hairy and just not the kind of saturation sound that I like. What I do love, however, is Fat Effects, as I've spoken about so many times on this YouTube channel, particularly for this kind of thing. So over here, this distortion section, this is what we're going to use, and we're going to basically put these three bands in this order. So we're going to go tube, dirt, saturation. I'm actually going to do it this way so that we can see it visually here. I'm going to set this to tube. I'm going to set this to dirt. And then this one here, I'm going to change this to exciter. And what this is going to give us is a little bit of like tube preamp style going into a tape machine. We're going to use very, very small amounts of this. And then this dirt saturation here, for me, often sounds kind of tapey. You've got the soft saturation as well, which is quite nice. But this dirt saturation, I think, is really good for just adding a bit of character. And then the exciter is just going to bring a bit of top end, a bit of harmonic saturation in the top end, which is a bit more exciting. And we're going to use these three things, and these three things only, to shape this sort of tapey feel. And then maybe a little bit of the bass enhancer as well if we feel like it needs it. So we're going to add that afterwards. But we're not going to use anything else. These are just the parts we're using. And we're going to bring some of that analog character to this. Let's try this. Let's see what feels good. And let's see if we can bring some of that nostalgic, analog-y feeling to this mix, but also retain the excitement and the airy openness at the same time.
Oh, say it like you mean it. Oh, say it like you mean it for me. Oh, tell me that you feel it.
Yeah, that's nice. It's bringing a real warmth and character to the mix, and that crunchiness that's in the drums and in the guitars is brought out a little bit more. It's enhanced. It has this nostalgic feeling to me, but it's also still uplifting and exciting because we're using some of this exciter. It sounds as though it's getting louder, but if you actually look at the meters, it's not really jumping up. It's just where we're adding these harmonics and that harmonic excitement. It has more energy, it has more perceived loudness. Let's see if we can bring a little bit more low end in with this bass enhancer and see what this sounds like. Let's set it to like 40 hertz or something low, just add a small amount in.
Oh, say it like you mean it for me. Oh, tell me that you feel it.
Yeah, great. That feels nice. It feels like it has some real kind of analog richness and excitement and character to it. And I'm really happy with how that sounds. Okay, so lastly, I just want to see if I can push the tone even further. And the way that I like to do this is by using the vintage Tube EQ in the vintage EQ collection. This is a Pultec style EQ. And these Pultec style kind of things are great on the mix bus because they are big, broad strokes. There's a bit of vintage character, I guess, to them because they're, modeled on very old EQ technology. So they're very smooth in terms of their boosts and, it's not precise at all. It's very much broad strokes. So we're going to use this to see if we can open up that top end even further, just see how far we can push it basically in order to still retain that warmth and that thickness, but also bring more of that dreamy detail out and just give the song the feeling that it needs. So let's dial something in and see what feels good. I'm going to set the high bandwidth all the way to maximum, so it's going to be doing big broad boosts. And let's set the low frequency to 30 down here. Maybe do a little bit more of a bump in the low end again. And boost some of this top end and just see what feels good.
Oh, say it like you mean it for me. Oh, tell me that you feel it.
Yeah, that's feeling really nice and dreamy and big, and it feels like it's really elevating in that section. As I mentioned before, the vocal processing at the minute is just a placeholder thing that I use with this vocal rack. I haven't actually really dialed this in at all. So we know this placeholder is doing a really good job on the vocal already. So when it comes to actually processing the vocal properly, we can do less. Same with the backing vocals. I'm actually not processing these backing vocals at all. And they're sitting in the mix quite nicely because of all the work that we've done on the mix bus. And this is why it's so important. So this is doing a really good job of just shaping that. It's making it sound smoother. It's making it feel more polished and more airy. I feel like there is a little bit of mid-range harshness that could be toned down a bit. And again, rather than having to go into all of the different guitar parts and the vocal and the synth parts and remove harshness in all of them, we can just open this Tube EQ, set it to, let's say, 2K, 2.5K, usually somewhere around there is where it's going to be a little bit honky and a little bit like harsh. And we'll dip out some of that mid-range and see what it sounds like.
When I think about my life, I think about yours. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it. When I think about my life, I think about yours. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it.
Yeah, cool. It's really enhancing the mix in the right ways. Just bringing a bit of that low mid warmth back in so that we make sure we're not losing that and scooping too much of that out. And we're dipping around about 3K just to get rid of a bit of harshness. And this just means that we have to do less. Like I say, when it comes to doing the individual tracks, we're going to process the vocals next week. And when it comes to doing that, it means that we can do less. And that's what we want. We just want to do this big broad stroke stuff, shape the tone of the mix as much as possible so that we're not overcooking those individual parts. And you can see still on the whole mix, there's hardly any processing going on. You know, we have this stuff going on the drum bus, and then on the individual tracks, there's hardly anything happening. And then obviously over here, we have this quite long vocal chain in terms of this vocal rack. But like I said, this is just a placeholder at the moment. And then again, on all of this stuff over here, these backing vocals, there's no processing. And it's all because we're doing all this tone shaping on the mix bus. And that's what's making it cohesive. The balance and the big broad strokes shaping is what is crucial to building a mix that is cohesive and everything has a place, but it doesn't feel cluttered and it doesn't feel over-processed. So let's take a quick before and after listen to the difference that we made with this mix bus processing.
When I think about my life, I think about yours. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it. Oh, say it like you mean it. For me, oh, tell me that you feel it.
You can hear what a difference that's made to the mix. It feels totally different. It feels much more polished. It feels much more open and airy, but we're still preserving the groove. We're still preserving the warmth and that analog nostalgic feeling. If anything, we've enhanced that as well, but we just made the whole thing feel open and feel much more closer to a finished mix now. And obviously there's things that still need dialing in properly, and you know, the vocal is too bright in places, and we haven't done anything on these backing vocals yet. We will do all of that, but it's given us kind of the signpost towards the end of the mix now. You know, we built the balance a few weeks ago where we made sure that we really focused on pushing as much feeling and energy out of the song, just using volume and then panning and placement, and then going into last week where I was just mixing it and showing you the sort of reduction process and taking things away and removing anything that shouldn't be there. This week we've enhanced the mix using the mix bus processing. So now really all that's left to do is just get that vocal in, make sure the vocal sounds as good as it can possibly sound. And we really focus on getting that vocal sound right, and then just fitting everything else in around it, small little details, just nip and tuck, getting everything to fit together. And then the mix is probably pretty much there. So that for me is why mix bus processing is so effective and so important. And it's worth noting that I don't necessarily always treat dynamic, width and tone as three completely separate processes which always happen in this linear order. Like for example, the mix bus compression here primarily affects the dynamic, but it can also have an impact on the width and the tone of your mix. And in this case, I've started with compression and dynamic control, but sometimes I'll start by doing tone shaping if I feel that's what the mix needs. If I feel like the first thing I need to do is actually shape the tone of this mix. Maybe the mix is feeling too dark and I just want to brighten it up a little bit, or maybe there's some harshness in the mix that just needs a bit dialing out. Sometimes I'll start with that tone shaping and then I'll do some dynamic control, and then I'll do a bit more tone shaping. Other times I might start with saturating the mix and giving it that super tapey sound if that's what I feel like it needs. And that's also going to have an impact on the tone and the dynamic and even sometimes the width of the mix as well. So it's not totally linear. But generally speaking, I like to consider the dynamic control of the mix, and then I like to build from there depending on what jumps out to me, experiment, play around with things, and see what fits for your song and see what works for the feeling of your mix. And if you want some help with this and you want some starting points, then go and check out my Ultimate Mastering Pack. It's not just for mastering your own music. These presets are designed for and can be used on the mix bus, and they give you different starting points so you can tweak to fit the feeling of your song. So you can check out that right now on the link in the description below. You can also grab the Ultimate Mastering Pack as part of my Logic Pro Everything Bundle, which is my complete toolkit of vocal chains, mixing presets, mix bus chains, and loads of stuff designed to make mixing much easier in Logic Pro. And when you combine the Everything Bundle with this free mix template, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, you pretty much get access to my entire brain and my entire workflow, if that's something you wish to have. So as always, thanks for watching. Next week, we're going to be deep diving on the big one, which is lead vocal processing. So make sure you come back for that next Wednesday. In the meantime, you can catch up on the rest of the series on this playlist right here, and I'll see you next time.